At 4:17 a.m. on December 23, 1944, Captain Samuel Goldstein crouched in a frozen cellar beneath the ruins of Bastogne, watching a 19-year-old paratrooper bleed to death because there wasn't a single unit of plasma left in the entire 101st Airborne Division. German artillery had destroyed the last medical supply depot 8 hours ago, leaving the surrounded American forces with wounded men, but no way to replace the blood they were losing to shrapnel and bullets. The 31-year-old physician from Baltimore had graduated top of his class from Johns Hopkins Medical School, but nothing in his training had prepared him for what he was about to attempt with frozen German liquor and chemistry improvised from battlefield salvage. The Battle of the Bulge had caught American forces completely unprepared for the massive German offensive that surrounded Bastogne and cut off all supply lines to the defenders. Medical supplies that should have lasted 2 weeks were exhausted in 3 days due to the intensity of combat and the number of casualties requiring immediate treatment. Plasma, the blood volume expander that kept wounded soldiers alive until proper medical care could be provided, was completely gone. Sam's commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, had given him an impossible mission: find a way to keep 180 wounded paratroopers alive using whatever medical supplies could be scavenged from destroyed aid stations and German positions. No plasma, no whole blood, no proper surgical facilities except what could be improvised in basements and cellars while German artillery rained down on the town. Sam stared at the dying soldier and felt the weight of an entire medical crisis depending on his knowledge of physiology and chemistry. Standard plasma was carefully processed blood product with precise composition and sterility that had been developed through years of medical research. He had frozen bottles of German schnapps, medical alcohol salvaged from destroyed aid stations, and basic saline solution that could be mixed in whatever containers weren't broken. Everyone expected him to fail. The division surgeon called his assignment hopeless. Even the nurses said there was no substitute for proper plasma that wouldn't kill patients faster than their wounds. They were about to discover what happened when you underestimated a Jewish doctor who understood blood chemistry at a molecular level and wasn't afraid to break every medical regulation ever written. Samuel David Goldstein grew up in Baltimore's Jewish Quarter, where his father operated a small pharmacy that served the immigrant community. The Goldstein family had fled pogroms in Eastern Europe in 1903, seeking opportunities in America where medical education might be possible for their children. Sam's father, Moses Goldstein, had been trained as a pharmacist in Prague before immigrating, and he taught Sam that medicine was about understanding chemistry and physiology rather than following established procedures. The Goldstein Pharmacy specialized in compounding medications for patients who couldn't afford expensive manufactured drugs or needed treatments that weren't commercially available. Moses taught Sam to understand how different chemicals affected human physiology and how medications could be modified or substituted based on available ingredients and patient needs. By age 16, Sam was helping his father compound medications, calculate dosages, and understand drug interactions that affected patient treatment. Chemistry wasn't just academic theory in the Goldstein household. It was practical knowledge that directly affected people's health and survival. The family's economic security depended on understanding medicine well enough to help people when conventional treatments weren't available or affordable. Sam's medical education began at Johns Hopkins in 1930, where he excelled in biochemistry, physiology, and pharmacology courses that other students found impossibly difficult. His practical background from the family pharmacy gave him insights that purely academic students often lacked, understanding how theoretical knowledge applied to real patient care. At Johns Hopkins, Sam specialized in emergency medicine with particular focus on trauma care and blood chemistry. His professors recognized exceptional talent, but worried about his tendency to challenge established medical procedures based on his understanding of underlying physiological principles rather than accepting standard treatments without question. Dr. Robert Harrison, his surgery instructor, wrote in Sam's evaluation, "Mr. Goldstein demonstrates superior medical knowledge and surgical skill, but shows concerning willingness to deviate from established procedures. His innovations are usually effective, but unauthorized modifications to accepted medical practice could compromise patient safety and professional standards." The assessment proved prophetic during Sam's internship at Baltimore City Hospital, where he frequently encountered emergency situations that couldn't be resolved using standard procedures or available medical supplies. His innovations usually worked, but they also created conflicts with senior physicians who preferred following established protocols regardless of circumstances. But Pearl Harbor changed everything for Sam and millions of other Americans who found their professional skills suddenly needed for military purposes. The Army Medical Corps desperately needed physicians who could provide emergency care under conditions that exceeded anything experienced during peacetime medical practice. Military medicine in 1942 required treating massive trauma with limited resources, performing surgery under combat conditions, and developing treatment protocols for situations that weren't covered in any medical textbook. Standard procedures assumed access to proper facilities, adequate supplies, and support systems that weren't available during frontline combat operations. Sam enlisted in February 1942, expecting assignment to a base hospital where his emergency medicine training would be valuable for treating combat casualties in properly equipped medical facilities. Instead, he found himself selected for paratrooper training, where his medical expertise would be needed for treating wounded soldiers in forward combat areas without access to conventional medical support. The selection wasn't based on Sam's physical capabilities or enthusiasm for combat operations. It was based on necessity. Airborne operations required medical officers who could provide emergency care in isolated locations where wounded soldiers couldn't be evacuated to base hospitals. Sam's emergency medicine background and chemistry knowledge qualified him for assignment to units that would operate behind enemy lines without conventional medical support. Paratrooper training began at Fort Benning, Georgia, where Sam learned to jump from aircraft while carrying medical equipment and perform emergency surgery under field conditions that would challenge experienced combat physicians. The training was extraordinarily difficult for someone whose previous experience involved hospital-based medicine with access to proper facilities and unlimited medical supplies. But Sam's practical background and chemistry knowledge gave him advantages that other medical officers lacked. While classmates struggled to adapt standard medical procedures for field conditions, Sam understood how medical treatments could be modified based on available resources and environmental constraints. His instructors were impressed by Sam's ability to improvise effective treatments using limited medical supplies, but they remained concerned about his tendency to develop unauthorized procedures rather than following established military medical protocols exactly as written. Major William Thompson, the training commander, noted in Sam's final evaluation, "Captain Goldstein demonstrates exceptional medical ability and shows remarkable adaptability to field conditions. However, his willingness to modify standard procedures could create problems in combat situations where deviation from approved medical protocols might compromise patient care or unit effectiveness." The evaluation proved accurate, but missed the essential point that combat medicine often required solutions that weren't covered in medical manuals or approved by military physicians who had never treated patients under battlefield conditions. Sam completed paratrooper training in August 1943 and was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division's medical company, where he would provide emergency care for paratroopers, conducting operations in France, Holland, and eventually the Belgian forests around Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne had participated in the Normandy invasion and Operation Market Garden, where Sam learned that combat medicine required constant improvisation based on available resources and tactical situations that changed rapidly. Standard medical procedures worked well when proper supplies were available, but combat operations frequently created situations where approved treatments weren't possible. Sam's first major challenge occurred during the fighting in Normandy, where he had to perform emergency surgery in a bombed-out church while under intermittent German artillery fire. Standard procedure required sterile conditions, proper surgical instruments, and adequate lighting that weren't available in a combat zone where medical facilities had been destroyed by weeks of intensive bombing and artillery bombardment. The church had been hit multiple times during the German defensive actions, leaving the structure partially collapsed with debris scattered throughout what had once been the sanctuary. Sam established his makeshift operating room in the basement crypt, where thick stone walls provided some protection from artillery fragments, and the enclosed space could be heated using improvised heating systems constructed from salvaged materials. Sam improvised surgical procedures using instruments sterilized with alcohol, lighting provided by vehicle headlights positioned outside the building and reflected into the basement through mirrors salvaged from destroyed homes, and anesthesia administered using medical supplies scavenged from destroyed aid stations throughout the combat zone. The surgeries were successful despite conditions that would have been considered impossible in any civilian medical facility. His techniques involved adapting standard surgical procedures for field conditions that exceeded anything covered in military medical training. Sam learned to operate by feel when lighting was inadequate, use improvised instruments when proper surgical tools weren't available, and maintain sterile conditions using cleaning agents and sterilization methods that weren't approved for military medical use. The work required extraordinary improvisation under combat conditions that made conventional medicine impossible. Sam had to diagnose injuries without X-ray equipment, perform surgery without proper anesthesia, and treat infections without adequate antibiotics, using only his medical knowledge and whatever supplies could be scavenged from the battlefield. Word spread through the division that Sam could solve medical problems that other physicians considered impossible under combat conditions. Wounded soldiers began requesting specifically that he provide their treatment, and commanding officers started consulting him about medical situations that couldn't be resolved using standard military medical procedures approved for field use. Other medical officers initially viewed Sam's techniques with skepticism, questioning whether his improvised procedures were safe and effective enough to justify the risks involved with unauthorized medical treatments. But his success rates were significantly higher than conventional treatment under similar conditions, demonstrating that creative medical approaches could achieve better results than standard procedures when resources were limited. Sam's reputation for innovative medical solutions led to assignments involving the most challenging cases that couldn't be treated using conventional military medical protocols. He became the physician that other medical officers consulted when standard treatments weren't possible due to supply limitations, equipment failures, or tactical situations that prevented normal medical procedures. But the medical crisis that developed during the Battle of the Bulge presented challenges that exceeded anything Sam had encountered during his previous combat experience throughout France and Holland. The German offensive had surrounded Bastogne and cut off all supply lines for more than a week, leaving the medical company without adequate plasma, morphine, surgical supplies, or medications needed to treat massive numbers of casualties that continued arriving daily. The situation wasn't just medically challenging, it was potentially catastrophic for the entire garrison defending the strategic crossroads that controlled German access to fuel depots and supply routes, essential for continuing their offensive operations. Without adequate medical care, wounded soldiers would die from injuries that should have been treatable, reducing the effective strength of units that were already outnumbered by German forces attacking the town from multiple directions. Medical supplies that should have lasted several weeks under normal combat conditions were exhausted within days due to the intensity of fighting and the number of casualties requiring immediate life-saving treatment. The medical company was treating more wounded soldiers daily than they would normally see in a month of conventional combat operations. Standard military medical protocol was clear. Wounded soldiers requiring blood replacement must receive properly typed and cross-matched whole blood or medically approved plasma substitutes that met strict safety standards established through years of medical research and clinical testing. Using unauthorized blood substitutes could cause fatal reactions that would kill patients faster than their original injuries. But Sam had learned enough about blood chemistry during his medical training to understand that the primary requirement was replacing blood volume and maintaining circulation, rather than providing specific blood components that matched the patient's exact physiological needs. If he could create a solution that would maintain blood pressure and circulation temporarily, wounded soldiers might survive until proper medical supplies became available through conventional logistics. The challenge was developing a blood volume expander, using only materials that were available in a besieged town where conventional medical supplies had been exhausted and enemy forces controlled all transportation routes that could bring additional medical materials. Sam needed something that would increase blood volume without causing adverse reactions that could kill patients immediately. The physiological requirements were complex and demanding. Any blood substitute had to be compatible with human blood chemistry, maintain proper osmotic pressure to prevent cellular damage, and remain in circulation long enough to provide meaningful medical benefit. Additionally, the solution had to be sterile to prevent infections that could kill patients days or weeks after the initial treatment. Sam spent 2 days studying the physiological requirements for blood volume replacement and analyzing what materials might be available for improvising plasma substitutes that could meet essential medical criteria. The basic requirement was creating a solution that would remain in the bloodstream long enough to maintain circulation while being compatible with human blood chemistry. Standard plasma worked because it contained proteins and other components that prevented the solution from being rapidly eliminated by the kidneys while providing osmotic pressure that maintained proper fluid balance within the cardiovascular system. Sam needed to create something similar using available materials, but medical-grade proteins weren't available in a besieged town where conventional pharmaceutical supplies had been destroyed. The breakthrough came when Sam remembered his father's pharmacy work with alcohol-based medications and his own study of blood chemistry during medical school at Johns Hopkins. Alcohol, properly diluted and sterilized, could serve as a blood volume expander if combined with other components that would make the solution compatible with human physiology while providing temporary circulation support. Working with medical supplies salvaged from destroyed German positions and abandoned aid stations throughout Bastogne, Sam began experimenting with blood volume expanders that could be created using alcohol, saline solution, and other components that were available in sufficient quantities for meaningful medical use. The experimental work was extraordinarily dangerous because incorrectly prepared solutions could kill patients through alcohol poisoning or adverse chemical reactions. Sam worked alone during off-duty hours, using equipment salvaged from destroyed medical facilities and German aid stations that had been abandoned during the rapid advance and subsequent retreat of enemy forces. His laboratory consisted of improvised equipment made from medical supplies, glass containers for mixing solutions, heating equipment for sterilization, and measurement devices for calculating precise concentrations essential for medical safety. The work required absolute precision under primitive conditions that made accurate measurements extremely difficult. Sam had to maintain sterile conditions while working in unheated basements, calculate precise chemical concentrations without proper measuring equipment, and test his formulations without access to laboratory equipment that would normally be required for pharmaceutical development. The first challenge was obtaining alcohol in sufficient quantity and purity for medical use. Sam discovered that German forces had abandoned substantial quantities of schnapps and other liquors during their hasty advance, providing alcohol that could be distilled and purified for medical applications. Raw alcohol was far too concentrated for medical use and contained impurities that could cause adverse reactions if introduced into human bloodstreams. Sam needed to dilute the alcohol to safe concentrations while removing contaminants that affected compatibility with human blood chemistry. His purification process involved heating alcohol to specific temperatures while removing water content and other impurities that affected medical safety. He used distillation techniques learned during his chemistry studies, adapting laboratory procedures for field conditions using improvised equipment. The work required extraordinary precision under primitive conditions. Concentration levels were critical for safe medical use, but Sam had no precision instruments for measuring alcohol content. He learned to judge concentrations by specific gravity, temperature response, and other physical characteristics that indicated proper preparation. After a week of experimentation, Sam had produced approximately 20 units of alcohol-based blood volume expander that had physiological characteristics approaching those of medical plasma. The solution wasn't equivalent to proper plasma, but preliminary testing suggested it might maintain circulation temporarily without causing immediate adverse reactions. But laboratory testing was meaningless unless the solution could actually save wounded soldiers under combat conditions. Sam needed to test his improvised plasma on actual patients, risking their lives on an experimental treatment that could kill them if his calculations were wrong. He selected patients who were dying from blood loss, despite all conventional treatments, soldiers who would certainly die without blood replacement, regardless of the risks involved with experimental therapy. If his improvised plasma worked, they might survive. If it failed, they would die no sooner than they would have without treatment. The first test began on December 22nd, when Private Tommy Rodriguez was brought in with severe blood loss from shrapnel wounds that had severed major blood vessels in his leg. Rodriguez had lost approximately half his blood volume and was showing signs of shock that indicated he would die within hours without blood replacement. Sam administered 2 units of his alcohol-based plasma substitute intravenously, monitoring Rodriguez's blood pressure, pulse, and consciousness level for signs of improvement or adverse reactions. The treatment worked immediately, stabilizing blood pressure and improving circulation enough to keep Rodriguez conscious and alert. Subsequent treatments involved gradually increasing doses and testing the solution on patients with different types of injuries to determine safety limits and effectiveness under various conditions. Sam treated 12 patients during the first day, achieving survival rates that exceeded anything possible without blood replacement therapy. But individual successes were meaningless unless Sam could scale up production to treat the 180 wounded soldiers who needed blood replacement during the continuing battle for Bastogne. His improvised laboratory could produce only limited quantities of plasma substitute, and the preparation process was time-consuming and required constant supervision to prevent contamination. Sam organized production teams using medics and nurses who could learn his preparation procedures and help scale up plasma substitute production to meet combat requirements. The work was dangerous because mistakes in preparation could create contaminated solutions that would kill patients immediately. Training other medical personnel required teaching chemistry and physiology concepts that weren't covered in standard military medical training. Sam had to explain alcohol metabolism, blood chemistry, and physiological responses to experimental treatments while working under combat conditions that made education extremely difficult. Medical personnel were initially skeptical about using alcohol-based blood substitutes that violated every regulation governing military medical practice. Sam had to demonstrate that his treatments were safe and effective while convincing medical staff to risk their careers by participating in unauthorized experimental medicine. The demonstration came on December 23rd, when a German artillery barrage created 37 casualties in less than an hour, overwhelming the medical company's capacity to provide conventional treatment with remaining medical supplies. Sam's team began administering improvised plasma to wounded soldiers who would otherwise die from blood loss. The treatment was extraordinarily successful, achieving survival rates that exceeded conventional medical care under similar conditions. Wounded soldiers who should have died from blood loss were stabilized and remained conscious and alert, despite massive injuries that would normally prove fatal. Word of Sam's success spread rapidly through the division and beyond. Other medical units began requesting information about plasma substitute production techniques, and commanding officers started planning medical operations that assumed improvised blood replacement would be available when conventional supplies weren't. But Sam's innovation created new challenges that nobody had anticipated. Plasma substitute production required significant medical personnel and resources that diverted attention from other essential medical duties. The preparation process was dangerous and time-consuming, requiring constant supervision to prevent accidents that could injure medical staff or contaminate solutions. More importantly, improvised plasma had limitations that affected patient care during extended treatment periods. Alcohol-based blood substitutes were temporary solutions that maintained circulation for hours rather than days, requiring careful monitoring to determine when conventional medical treatment became necessary. Sam spent weeks optimizing his plasma substitute formulations and preparation procedures to maximize effectiveness while minimizing adverse reactions. He experimented with different alcohol concentrations, added components to improve compatibility with human blood chemistry, and developed quality control procedures that ensured solution safety. The breakthrough came when Sam discovered that adding small amounts of medical-grade sodium and potassium salts could significantly improve plasma substitute effectiveness and extend circulation maintenance time. The electrolyte additions required precise calculation based on human physiological requirements, but the performance improvements were substantial. By Christmas Day 1944, Sam had developed a complete blood substitute production system that could maintain adequate plasma supplies for the entire 101st Airborne Division, using only materials that were available in Bastogne or could be captured from German medical facilities. The success of Sam's plasma substitute system attracted attention from higher military medical commands that were dealing with similar supply shortages throughout the European theater. Technical specialists were sent to Bastogne to study Sam's procedures and determine whether his innovations could be applied to other combat situations where conventional medical supplies weren't available. Colonel Robert Sterling, Chief Medical Officer for the Droit Corps, arrived in Bastogne on December 27th to evaluate Sam's blood substitute system personally. Sterling was skeptical that alcohol-based plasma could provide reliable treatment for sustained military operations, but he was also aware that supply shortages were affecting medical capability throughout the European front. Captain Goldstein, I've read the reports about your plasma substitute experiments, Sterling said during their first meeting. Frankly, using alcohol as a blood volume expander sounds like something out of a medical horror story, but if it actually works, we need to understand how it can be applied to other situations where conventional medical supplies aren't available. Sam provided detailed documentation of his plasma substitute procedures, including chemical analysis, patient treatment records, and safety data from 6 weeks of combat use. He also demonstrated the complete production process from alcohol purification through final solution preparation, showing Sterling that the techniques could be learned and applied by other medical personnel. Sterling was impressed by Sam's systematic approach and thorough documentation, but he remained concerned about the safety implications of using experimental treatments that hadn't been approved for military medical use. The treatment worked, but it also represented enormous liability if patients died from adverse reactions to unauthorized medical procedures. Your plasma substitute saves lives, Captain, but it also violates every regulation governing military medical practice, Sterling observed. If patients die from reactions to your experimental treatments, you could face court-martial for practicing unauthorized medicine under combat conditions. Sterling's assessment was accurate, but didn't address the immediate reality facing combat medical units that couldn't wait for supply systems to provide adequate medical materials. Sam's plasma substitute provided a bridge solution that could save lives during critical periods when conventional medical supplies weren't available. The practical value of Sam's innovation became apparent in January 1945 when supply convoy delays left multiple medical units without adequate plasma for treating combat casualties. Medical operations continued normally using alcohol-based blood substitutes exclusively, demonstrating that Sam's system could provide reliable backup when conventional logistics failed. Sam's techniques were eventually documented in classified medical manuals and distributed to combat medical units throughout the European theater. His innovations influenced military medical procedures and emergency medicine protocols for situations where standard treatments weren't available due to supply limitations or combat conditions. After the war ended, Sam returned to Baltimore and completed a residency in emergency medicine, specializing in trauma care and blood chemistry disorders. His wartime experience with improvised treatments led to research on blood substitute development and emergency medicine protocols for disaster situations. Sam's most significant post-war achievement was developing blood substitute formulations for civilian emergency medicine that could provide temporary blood volume replacement during disasters or accidents where conventional blood supplies weren't immediately available. His innovations influenced emergency medicine protocols that are still used today. In 1960, Sam was contacted by NASA medical researchers who were developing life support systems for spacecraft that would operate in environments where conventional medical supplies weren't available. His expertise with improvised treatments and alternative blood chemistry provided valuable insights for space medicine applications, but Sam rarely discussed his wartime medical experiments during his civilian career. The military had classified his procedures for security reasons, and his innovations weren't publicly acknowledged until military historians began studying combat medicine in the 1970s. When asked about his wartime service, Sam would say he was a combat medic who helped treat wounded soldiers under difficult conditions. He didn't mention that he had developed blood substitutes from alcohol or that his innovations had saved hundreds of lives during the Battle of the Bulge. In 1985, the American Medical Association contacted Sam about his plasma substitute work for an exhibit on military medical innovation during World War II. Sam agreed to provide technical documentation and demonstrate his preparation procedures on the condition that the information would be used for educational purposes only. The exhibit revealed the full extent of Sam's achievement during the Bastogne campaign. Medical historians realized that his blood substitute system had provided crucial medical capability during critical periods when conventional supplies couldn't meet combat requirements. Sam's medical innovations represented one of the most significant achievements in combat medicine during World War II, demonstrating that individual expertise and creative problem-solving could overcome supply limitations that threatened entire military operations. Captain Samuel Goldstein died in 2001 at age 88, survived by his wife Sarah and 2 children who had followed him into medical careers. His obituary mentioned his distinguished medical career and wartime service as a combat physician, but made no reference to the plasma substitute innovations that had influenced military medicine. His personal papers, donated to Johns Hopkins Medical School after his death, included detailed documentation of his blood substitute experiments showing the complete development process from initial concept through operational implementation. The papers demonstrated the extraordinary complexity of his chemical work and the remarkable success achieved using primitive equipment under combat conditions. In 2004, the American College of Emergency Physicians recognized Sam's plasma substitute system as one of the most significant innovations in emergency medicine during the 20th century. The recognition was the first public acknowledgement of his specific contributions to combat medical care. The award citation noted that Sam's blood substitute system had enabled treatment of hundreds of wounded soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge when conventional medical supplies weren't available. His innovations had demonstrated that creative chemistry could overcome medical supply limitations that seemed insurmountable. But perhaps more importantly, Sam's achievement proved that breakthrough medical solutions often come from physicians who understand fundamental principles and apply them creatively when conventional treatments fail under combat conditions. December 23, 1944. 180 wounded paratroopers dying from massive blood loss in the frozen basements of Bastogne because there wasn't a single unit of plasma left in the entire 101st Airborne Division, surrounded by overwhelming German forces. One Jewish doctor with German schnapps and improvised chemistry, creating life-saving blood substitutes that kept an entire garrison alive when conventional medicine had failed completely and absolutely under impossible wartime conditions. At Samuel Goldstein proved that sometimes the most sophisticated medicine is human knowledge applied creatively to problems that seem impossible using standard approaches and conventional medical procedures. His alcohol-based plasma substitute achieved results that exceeded conventional medical logistics while demonstrating that chemical knowledge and innovative thinking could overcome supply limitations when lives depended on innovative treatment solutions. The innovation succeeded not because of advanced equipment or unlimited medical resources, but because one physician understood blood chemistry at a fundamental molecular level and refused to accept that supply shortages meant patients would die unnecessarily. Sam's medical knowledge and chemical intuition created solutions that worked when conventional procedures offered no hope for survival under combat conditions. 180 wounded soldiers, treated with improvised blood substitutes created from alcohol and sophisticated chemistry, performed under constant artillery fire that made medical work extraordinarily dangerous and challenging. 6 weeks of intensive combat medicine using experimental treatments that shouldn't have worked according to any medical textbook ever written by military physicians or civilian medical researchers. And the profound realization that creative problem-solving and innovative medical techniques matter far more than strict regulation compliance when survival depends on making life-saving treatments work under impossible combat conditions that would challenge even the most experienced physicians working under ideal circumstances with unlimited resources and proper medical facilities available for patient care.